In this video I will present 16 albums that I believe made heavy metal take a step forward, made heavy metal evolve. We are talking about albums that, without them, the course of heavy music would have been very different. Albums for which there was a before and an after. We are not talking about the most popular albums, or my favorite albums, or even the best albums. We are talking about the albums that changed, more or less, the course of history of this sound. And they did it in various ways. Some because they contained a form of music that had never been heard before. Some because they took forms of music that had been heard but combined them in a unique and groundbreaking way. And some simply because they became so popular that they taught the world a new musical genre. It doesn't matter how or why it happened. What matters is that it happened. Before I start, I want to say that, as always, in videos of this kind, what follows is my personal opinion, which is based on years of listening to and reading about the genre we call heavy metal. Those of you who disagree can write it in the comments, making your own suggestions and remarks. As you have noticed, I have no problem with such comments, especially when they are polite and do not offend others. The albums are listed in absolute chronological order. The stories that have been written about this album are as classic as the album itself. The Triton, the Devil's Music, Tony Iommi cutting his fingertips that led to the loosening of the guitar strings and a heavier sound. The band realizing horror movies were bringing much more people to the cinema across the street and deciding to do something similar in music and so much more. As soon as the sound of rain and the bell were heard, something changed in music worldwide. The truth is that if we look at it objectively, aside from the title track, everything else is closer to heavy psych, which was quite fashionable in the underground heavy sound of the time. The truth is also that if you ask the band themselves about what they played, they would tell you heavy rock. The term heavy metal didn't exist yet. But none of that matters. History was written one way or another.
And you turn your back, I'll attack.
From the moment the first notes of Victim of Changes are heard, we have the birth of modern heavy metal as we know it. Judas Priest took the heavy sound of the era and decided to remove all the elements of the 67-70 period from it except the heaviness itself. Out with the blues, out with psychedelia, out with rock and roll, out with the sound of the Hammond organ, out with all the old influences. Some have also mentioned other albums from that period, such as Rising by Rainbow or In Trance by Scorpions. Elements of modern heavy metal can be found on both of these, but not with such a clear and distinct approach as here. And let's not forget that a band from Birmingham also invented the image of the style a few years later. Very soon their sound will be adopted by various bands of the new wave of British heavy metal, and metal will enter its modern era, as we know it today and as it triumphed in the 1980s. Three kids from Newcastle want to make an album to honor their influences, namely Judas Priest and Motorhead, plus Black Sabbath in the lyrics and themes. But they are not the best musicians in the world, and the production of the sound is rather amateurish compared to the standards of the time. Result, a sound unlike anything ever heard in rock, heavy, violent, menacing and extreme, completely in your face. They may not have intended it exactly like that, but no one else in the heavy metal scene in 1981 sounded like them. All the extreme metal that followed, from thrash to death grind and I don't know what else, has this album as its starting point. Without them, nothing would have happened. As simple as that. You might still hear discussions about who really played thrash first. Overkill were the first to write a recorded song. Exodus were the first to give us a demo, and according to one version, they had already recorded all of Bonded by Blood before this album was released. Even about Exciter, they will tell you that they released their album 40 days before this one. For better or for worse, however, it was Metallica who made history. Overkill gave us their first release in 1984 and Exodus in 1985, when this was already legendary, while the Exciter album was heard by far fewer people and history claimed it as speed metal. So this is the birth of thrash metal. Budgie, Priest and Motorhead, new wave of British heavy metal and D-beat, and of course Venom in the back of the mind. Everything has been played somewhere before, but never like this. Another album that came out almost by chance. After completing the recordings of Spreading the Disease, Anthrax had some paid time left over in the studio. So, the two leaders and older members of the band, Scott Ian and Charlie Benanti, call two of their friends, Dan Lilker and Billy Milano, and record this album. They decide to combine the thrash metal that their main band plays with the hardcore punk that had always been a major influence on them. But here, we are not talking about influence. Here, things are evenly split. Thrash metal and hardcore punk. Songs no longer than 1 or 2 minutes, no solos, and Milano's silly humor create a mix that, without anyone expecting it, will prove irresistible. Were they really the first? I don't know. In Britain, hardcore punks had been experimenting with metal for quite some time, but the mentality was different and it hadn't reached the general public. And to be honest, DRI's dealing with it beat them by about a month. But the legendary album will ultimately be this one.
If you're out there all alone and you don't know where to go to, look up to the sky above and see the morning sun.
Germany had shown its intentions regarding heavy music early on. Scorpions accept Teutonic thrash, and these guys here. In 1987 they will make their big breakthrough. They change their singer, break away from the speed metal they were playing until then, which to be honest was very good, and find the path to global recognition that will lead them to Masters of Rock, American tours, and magazine covers in the British press. Oh, and along the way they also invented a musical genre, power metal. Wait, you'll tell me, didn't power metal already exist? Not exactly. There were some references in the press, but back then each journalist was inventing their own terms. And of course, here we are not talking about US power metal, which someone might say is practically modern heavy metal that isn't glam metal. No, here we're talking about European power metal. That is, take the classic heavy metal of Iron Maiden, a bit of the speed metal they had just left behind, the theatricality of Queen, and the pop sensibility of the Scorpions. Add the happiness that came out when the band played, and you have the mix, which today, 40 years later, continues to give us bands and albums, which none of them would exist without this record. The inspiration, the creativity, and simply the audacity that the three Swiss exhibited on this album I don't think had ever been seen before or since in the metal scene. We are talking about 1987, a year when the lines were fully drawn and anyone who crossed them took a huge risk. And we're talking about Celtic Frost, one of the foundational bands of the black metal sound, with landmark albums already in the repertoire. And what do? They cover a new wave band, add violins, opera, lyrics in French, Eastern sounds, and industrial beats. And all of this is combined with strange, whiny vocals that immediately bring to mind death rock band Christian Death. The result is strange, unique, and almost otherworldly. To describe what they are playing, a term appears that had never been associated with metal: avant-garde. No one was ready for an album like this back then, neither the fans nor the other musicians. It took nearly 10 years for experiments like this to be heard again and to become successful, when we say ahead of its time. Think about how incredible the year 1987 was. 3 months, 3 albums that changed the history of heavy music. We are not going to experience such moments again, unfortunately. This album is included here because it set a limit for us. It gave us a limit on how extreme heavy music can get. Beyond that, there is nothing. Beyond that, we are talking about noise. The story is probably known to some. Another lineup recorded the first side and another the second, with about 9 months difference between the two recordings. The shortest song of all time in the Guinness Book of Records is included here. The album has one foot, if not both, clearly placed in crust punk. From this scene come its musicians, to this scene its lyrics refer. However, soon the genre they invented will blend with death metal and be almost entirely adopted by the metal community. You can tell me that you have heard heavier albums, crazier albums, or even more otherworldly albums. I don't think anyone can claim to have heard a more extreme album than this one. I am saying this from the start. This album is not the first death metal album ever. Some have talked about Seven Churches by Possessed, others about Season of the Dead by Necrophagia, others about Teutonic thrash albums, others about Sepultura. For me, it was Scream Bloody Gore by Death themselves. But all these albums were still in an ambiguous state back then. Many still called them thrash or extreme thrash. This is the album that clarified things. This is the album that no one could call thrash anymore. Maybe it was the production of Scott Burns and the scorching railroad riffing. Maybe it was the monstrous growls of Chuck Schuldiner. Maybe it was the chilling cover by Ed Repka. Maybe it was all three. But this was something else. This was clearly death metal. And this was the album that entered in the homes of the metalheads of the time. This was the album that everyone talked about, even to say that the sound was noise and not music. Do you want more evidence? After this album, death metal took off globally and its releases multiplied. This album made Mori Sound Studios famous worldwide. And in the end, this album made history. When we talk about the beginning of strange alternative metal, 3 albums immediately come to mind: Living Color, Vivid, Jane's Addiction, Nothing Shocking, and this one. Could I have included the other 2? Yes. However, I believe that Vivid doesn't have as much variety in musical styles, while Nothing Shocking isn't as metal. I also thought about what the 3 bands did afterward, what legacy they left us. Of course, the main reason I chose it remains how brilliantly ahead of its time this album is. We are talking about an album of immense creativity that combines rap, funk, jazz and post-punk with thrash and monolithic Sabbath-like metal. an inconceivable risk at a time when genres were almost separated by walls, and a group of musicians who seemed to have been randomly chosen from the streets of a bohemian neighborhood in San Francisco. And at the top of the quintet, a voice and a personality who was just starting out at the time and whose mere presence already changed the entire dynamic of the band and made it soar. I'm of course talking about Mike Patton, the key personality in the immense success that this album found.
This is the throes of his embrace.
When I first heard this record, I knew something was different about it. It wasn't exactly death metal, and it wasn't exactly doom. And of course, there was also that strange song, Eternal. What the hell was that? Looking back, it seems completely strange to me that until 1991 there had been no conscious and serious attempt to merge Gothic rock with heavy metal. The two genres had many common elements, even more so after 1985, when Goth, with Emission, Fields of the Nephilim and Sisters of Mercy, was detached from post-punk and began to embrace the shapes and forms of rock. The cult had done something with Love, but it remained incomplete, just like the Sisters of Mercy with the unexpected guitar heaviness of Vision Thing. But these had come from the Gothic rock side, and metalheads considered it risqué to embrace them. The band from Halifax was the one that made the first complete, conscious move from the metal side with this album. Both the title and the content made it impossible for metal fans to ignore. Starting from here, in the very near future, the band themselves, their compatriots Anathema and My Dying Bride, and of course New Yorkers Typo Negative will evolve the style to unrecognizable levels and make it one of the most successful forms of metal in the 90s and beyond. The Texans started as a glam metal band influenced by Kiss, moved to more traditional US power metal, and in 1990, with a renewed image and a completely different aesthetic, they seemed to settle into a form of second wave thrash. But actually, they weren't done. In 1992, they give us their masterpiece, the true essence of what they want to achieve. The violence of thrash simplified and ground through Black Sabbath and Kiss, the low tunings on the guitars, and the groove as an integral part of the music. The immense success of this amalgamation will influence almost all forms of modern metal that would follow up to today. Now, because some of these forms have strayed too far from the roots of the genre, this has led to Pantera themselves being accused in their name. Unfairly in my opinion, because the Texans were not responsible for what others did to their sound. And let's not forget that they were essentially a simple heavy metal band, perhaps the only consistently successful one of the 90s. It was only natural for them to be heard by so many and to influence almost everyone. Although in my opinion the first authentic black metal album is Bathory's Under the Sign of the Black Mark from 1987, here we have the complete definition of the sound of the Norwegian scene. The tremolo picking and the wall of sound in the guitars, the manic drumming, the cold and otherworldly atmosphere, the shouted torn vocals, the satanic misanthropic lyrics, even the artwork with the black and white cover and the almost unreadable logo, all of it is here. The irony is that the original ideas, both in terms of sound and overall aesthetics, were from two people who are not present here. These were Øystein Euronymous Arseth and Snorre Blackthorn Rook. But that is now irrelevant. Darkthrone were the first to take the ideas and make them a reality, the first to record them in a tangible form. They were the ones who started writing history in 1992. And history wrote, black metal. When Digby Pearson, the boss of their label Earache, heard Carcass's new album in 1993, he couldn't hide his disappointment. What was this? Melody in death metal? Influences from classic heavy metal in the riffs and solos? But who will listen to it? Here we are talking about a band that initially became known as grindcore with gore lyrics and later released one of the greatest death metal albums of the classic era. Pearson himself will talk about the surprise he felt at how influential this album became, when every musician he signed was telling him about how they were imitating its ideas. Very few had attempted what the English dared to do here before this album. Maybe Entombed, maybe Dismember, but that's about it. The truth is that here I should have normally included Slaughter of the Soul by At the Gates, because that is generally considered to have started the melodic death metal genre. But that album wouldn't exist without this one. Nothing that followed in both melodic death metal and a part of metalcore would exist without this one. The Swedes started as a somewhat more conventional thrash band with their first album Contradictions Collapse. The proposal they made to us here for the year 1995 when it came out was completely different. It may have been inspired by death or groove metal, but it ventured into completely uncharted territory until that moment. You see, it combined the massive heavy guitar violence and guttural vocals with things that no one had ever thought to add to an extreme metal album until then. 7-string guitars, changes in meter and musical key, polyrhythms in the drums, jazz colors in the solos, dissonance, an entire generation of extreme sound meets King Crimson, Jaco Pastorius, and Gang of Four. So ahead of its time that it took 12 years for young musicians to understand it, process it, and start being influenced by it. For many years we were hearing about the relationship between classical music and heavy metal, about how Paganini, Wagner or Bach had more in common with metal musicians than with anything else in contemporary music, and we were listening to various attempts at combining classical music and heavy rock, Kashmir, Bohemian Rhapsody, Stargazer, some bits and pieces of Sabotage, and Celtic Frost of course. But nothing was done meticulously, nothing held for an entire album, and nothing had continuity. Until this album, the Swedish band, primarily its creative mastermind Kristoffer Jonsson, after the success of the symphonic elements in their previous album Lepaka Clifford, decides to go all in. It radically changes its sound, abandons death metal, and uses symphonic elements in all of the album tracks. They hire two different choirs to contribute to the vocals and create a complete amalgamation of heavy metal and classical music for the first time in history in such a way. The success will be great, mainly in Europe, and the influence the album will exert continues to be heard even today, 30 years after its release. For me, these were the albums that changed heavy metal, that made it evolve, that took it a step further. No matter how much I think about it, I can't find anything else. Whatever else I think of ultimately leads me back to these 16 albums. So you might ask me, are you saying that heavy metal stopped evolving after 1996? Not exactly, but the truth is that the new genres that emerged in the following years were either small variations of those that already existed, or done in a very small scale, or simply weren't metal enough to be included here. And that brings me to the next question you might ask me. Why not Korn? Converge? Kaias? All of them are excellent artists, and I agree that they released albums that changed things, that had a before and an after. Not for heavy metal though, for heavy rock. So we could see them in another video.